Hey now, Brawlers, it's time for another Board Game Brawl review with Nick Minahan, sponsored by BoardGameBliss.com.
Today we're going to take a look at Onward to Venus from, it's Dr. Groardbort's Onward to Venus for boys, girls, and fully grown humans. There's a lot of humor like that. But this is from Martin Wallace and his company, Tree Frog Games. Now, I confess that I know that this is based off of a series of graphic novels, but I didn't take the time to read them. I apologize, so I won't be able to comment on that because research is hard and I just didn't want to do it. No, I feel bad about it because, as I'll touch on more in my final thoughts, I think that the theme here is really interesting, and the artwork that is used from the graphic novels is just great. It's really, really good, but I'm getting ahead of myself. What the theme here is this retro sci-fi pulp, or pulp retro sci-fi, some combination of those words, where you have this sort of weird idealized version of what the future is like, as written by comic book authors from like the early 20th century. We still are divided into these different nations, and we have names like Lord Coxswain, and we use weapons that look like big, giant, stereotypical ray guns and muskets that shoot out lasers, and we go and try to take over the solar system, and all these planets that we now know are like Mars and Venus and Mercury that are completely inhospitable to life are populated with aliens, and there's robot uprisings, and there's people living on Mars, and there's supervillains out there too. So this is where Onward to Venus takes place, this type of world. And each player represents one of these nations who's in a race to go out to the solar system and essentially conquer it and take territory and get riches. That's essentially the goal of the game, is to get rich, which is a pretty cynical way to look at solar system travel, but nevertheless, there it is. This is area control. Each player is going to have a force of spaceships and infantry and space tanks that you're going to use to take control of each of these planets. So not necessarily take control, but take enough control to put your mines and your factories there and get some money. But of course, while you're doing this, the inhabitants of all these different planets in this fictitious world and all these other crazy goings on and robot uprisings, none of this is going to sit still while you just raid and pillage and plunder and try to stymie each other. See, I said it right this time. These may potentially pop, so to speak. There might be these crises around the solar system that you and the other players have to deal with, whether you like it or not. That's quite a mouthful that I just laid out there, but let's go ahead and take a brief look at how it's played. It's actually much simpler than it sounds. Then we're going to come back. I'll let you know what I think. Alright, I'm going to give you a brief overview of Onward to Venus. This is a retro pulp sci-fi themed game where you and the other players represent the different nations of this fictitious world who are vying for supremacy in the solar system. Of course, supremacy here just means being the richest player. What you want to do at the end of the game mechanically is have the most income generated on each of these different planets in the solar system and the moon. If you're able to do that, you're going to get a number of victory points depending on what place that you place in. Down on each of the planets, you have victory point modifiers. If you are the first place income generator with your mines and factories, you're going to get 10 points for Mars here. Second place gets 7, and third place gets 4. But not every planet. The smaller planets don't have a third place at all, and the other planets are actually worth less depending on how big that they are. But there are friendly ties in the game, which is an interesting aspect. Now, each player is going to start off with a whole regiment of troops in different units. You have infantry and tanks. The pictures are really small. It's not really worth showing you. And spaceships. And then you've got mines and factories. Infantry and tanks are going to be used to and spaceships are going to be used to try and take tiles and tokens and fight and potentially fight your opponents down on the planet. You're going to take a number of your infantry units and 2 of your spaceships and surround Earth with them in orbit. Whenever tokens are next to a planet, they're considered in orbit, and that's how the game is going to start. And this is assuming a 2-player game, obviously. And you're also going to have each player is going to have a factory down on Earth as well. So here's the setup. Now, also, each round you're going to populate each of these planets with a number of tiles that a sheet is going to tell you depending on the number of players. So in this setup for this number of players,
Earth and the other major planets are going to have 3 tiles on them, whereas the outer rim planets are only going to have 2 tiles on them. So let me go ahead and explain what those different tiles are. Well, we'll start with the easy ones. You have factories and mines. If you're allowed to take them, some of them have defense ratings, some of them don't. They vary in number, but if you're eligible to take a tile, which I'll explain in a moment, you can replace one of the factories or mines with potentially with one of your own factories and mines, and that's going to generate you income at the end of the game. Taking one of these tiles just automatically gets you that much income from the pile, which you're going to. The only thing that money is really used for in this game is for buying troops or recruiting new troops and then being able to use them later. This one immediately lets you draw 2 cards from the deck. Tension tiles are interesting because these are all that's going to let you use, they're the only thing that's going to let you attack other players in the game and try to take their mines and factories. If there's a tension tile, you can try and take the tension tile, which represents fighting your opponents. Then you have the crisis tiles. The crisis tiles are not only worth points at the end of the game if you're able to take them by conquering them, but also during one of the end phases of each period of the game is played over 3 periods, you may potentially have these crises happen, which I'll get back to in a second. And then you have big game tiles. Big game are just points that you can take. All you need to do is use 1 troop to go down to the planet, kill the big game, and take the tile as a point. Now, in addition to all of your different units and some money, you're also going to start with a stack of player-specific cards. Now, here's the blue players, France. So just to show you some examples, you have I'm not even going to try to say that, but this thing, which gives you a benefit, which is +2 movement. Anytime that you see benefit, this is a card that you can essentially play for free as part of another action. Here's Dr. Grordboard himself from the box. This requires an action. Each player gets 1 action on their turn. You're going to go around and around, and this one's going to require you to actually use that action, which is draw 4 cards, keep 2, and discard the other 2. Then you have Ms. Emerald II. Her benefit is if you re-roll 1 or more dice, and then each player is going to start off with some random cards as well. Here's some other ones that came out of the main deck. You have cards like these that are all they're going to do is give you more combat benefit when you're engaged in a combat in order to and when you're trying to take over stuff down on a planet or take a tile. There's a robot that gives you 3, and then there is the most powerful weapon in the game, the Moon Hater, which is going to give you 5 combat strength. Here's one of the benefit cards that actually increases the power of your tanks, which usually only give you 2 combat. This makes them 3 combat for this battle. This one makes your infantry worth 2 instead of 1. Here is another one of the action cards. This one lets you take a big game tile from any planet, which is essentially a free point. This one, as a free action, which means it costs you nothing on your turn, you can move one of your infantry units from surface to orbit, which I'll explain in a second. And then free action, you can perform to take 1 pass cube action, which I'll also explain momentarily. Alright, so once every player's got their random starting stuff and you've populated all the tiles, or all the different planet tiles with the smaller tiles, then it's going to be time to begin. You'll choose a first player, and then every player is going to go around and take 1 action. Now, the different types of actions you can do. First thing you can do is you can move. Moving requires a spaceship. 1 spaceship can take any number of other infantry units with it. Tanks, however, are landlocked. These are the tank tiles. These are going to be landlocked to a planet that they're built on unless you have a special card that says otherwise. But when you choose to move, you can take your force with you and you can leave some behind, but once you decide which ones you're going to take, they're a cohesive unit. You can't leave them behind or pick up stragglers. And then you can move 1 or 2 planets. Now, for the purpose of this game, the moon and Earth are adjacent to each other, so going from the Earth to the moon is 1 movement point. But going from, if you go from Venus or Mars, it's 1 to get to either Earth or the moon. Does that make any kind of sense? I don't know why I'm asking. You can't answer me. So there's that. Now, you can move 2 spaces if you want. And if you're in a hurry, that's what you should do. But then that's going to end your turn because that's a full action. But if you only move 1 space, then you get essentially a free action to take a tile. This is where you can take one of those tiles that was randomly strewn about one of these planets. And so if, for instance, here I decided to go to Mars, I could choose to take this card tile and draw 2 cards. I could choose to immediately move down one of my troops and take over this factory and replace it with one of my own factories. Or I could choose to try and take over this mine, which has a defense rating of 2. Now, how does that work, you might ask? Well, all conflicts in this game are going to be resolved with these 3 wooden dice. Now, these are 6-sided dice, except for one of the sides has, I'll just show you a little more detail, has a skull and crossbones on it, the 1, which actually counts for 0 in this game. So when you decide to enter conflict, what you're going to do, you're going to figure out what the starting defense rating is. So for this mine, it's a 2. Then you're going to roll the 3 dice. You eliminate the middle number, which in this case it's a tie, so you're going to take out one of these 2s. Then you subtract this, the smaller number from the bigger number, so this is a 2 and a 3. So the defense rating here is 1 added to the original 2, so it's 3. That means you have to have 3 combat points worth of troops and or cards, like those death rate cards I showed you earlier, to move down to the planet. Even if you have a bunch of cards, you always have to move at least 1 troop down if you succeed. And in this case, I would get to remove this mine. It just goes into the tile discard pile and replace it with my own. Taking other players' stuff is a little more complicated. First off, you can't even do it automatically. You have to have one of those tension tiles that I mentioned before. So if a tension tile is on a planet where someone else's stuff is, you can try and essentially take that tension tile in order to take someone's factory or mine that is on that planet. And it works the same way, where you have to roll the dice and subtract 1 and add that total to the defense. But in this case, the defense is the sum total of the opposing players' units in orbit and units on the planet as well. Usually when units are on the planet, they're kind of useless. They've already done what they're going to do. They've taken the tile, and now you have to wait until the end of the round for them to not be landlocked anymore. But in this case, for defense, they are all added to the total, which makes sense. So now you have to surpass that number, and if you're able to do that, the other player takes back their mine or factory, and they replace it with one of their own. So actually, let's just assume it's like this. So I would have much more of a stranglehold on Earth there. And remember that having a majority of income earned, not income generated, if that makes sense, is what's going to get you victory points at the end of the game. Now, going back to the actions that you can do on your turn, one of them is just to claim a tile. So if you already had your free, if you are not moving and you're already at a planet and you want to grab something, you can just use the claim a tile action, and it works the same way. You can also choose to buy units. You can buy either infantry, spaceships, or tanks. Now, infantry must be built at Earth, and no matter what you have on the planet, factories, mines, or not, you'll always be able to build infantry there. Same thing with tanks and spaceships. You can always build those at Earth, but you can also build those on other planets, but only if you have a factory on that planet. And again, tanks can't move on their own with spaceships. They have to be moved in a special way with cards. Otherwise, they're just really powerful 2 combat units that you can only use at that planet. You can also use actions on cards. I kind of covered a couple of examples of that already. And the last type of action you can take is to take one of these pass cubes. Now, the pass cubes are interesting because this is the only way that you're really going to tell that one of the periods, the 3 periods of the game, is going to end. When the last pass cube card is taken from this card, the round is going to end, and that last player who took the last cube is going to take the first player marker. So how this works is that when you take one of the pass cubes as your action, you are not out of the round. You can go back and take another action if you want, including taking more pass cubes to really expedite the round. But otherwise, you just draw a card, you get a card as compensation for taking a pass cube, and that's it. Now, at the end of each period, remember there's 3 periods of play, and they can be variable depending on how the pass cubes go. You'll do things like taking your units that you use to take stuff and putting them back into orbit, and getting your income from your mines and factories, and so on. But you're also going to do the crisis phase. The crisis phase is where you look at the crisis tiles that you have out on all the planets, and then see if any of them have skull and crossbones, and then roll the dice. Any die that comes up as the skull and crossbones symbol is going to have to be put onto the tile, starting with Mercury and working your way down. When you add up the total number of crisis tiles on a planet to the number of skull and crossbones that goes on the tiles that have skull and crossbones on them, then you may have a crisis. And by the way, I'm sorry, I have to take one step back. I forgot that when you're rolling the dice for combat, there's a potential for casualties. If you roll any skull or crossbones on the dice when you're rolling for a normal trying to take over roll, you might lose troops that are involved in the combat. Sorry, I should have mentioned that before. But moving on to the different crises, whenever there is a potential for crisis, you have to refer to this sheet, which will tell you what will happen if the level gets high enough on a certain planet, and it escalates and gets worse and worse. Except for Ganymede, nothing ever happens on Ganymede, as it says a couple times in the rulebook. And it might be something minor, like let's say level 2 on Earth, which each crisis is different. So on Earth, it's a robot rebellion. At level 2, the player with the highest income loses a minor factory. In the case of a tie, all those players suffer the same effect. Well, that's bad, but it's not like game-shatteringly bad. But if the level gets to 4 or more, the robots destroy humanity, the game is over, everybody loses. Okay, that's pretty bad. The Kuiper Belt, this is where these alien tokens could potentially come out. If the crisis gets too bad, aliens invade and they just start destroying mines and factories coming from the Kuiper Belt, how do you say that? I don't know. And moving your way down. And there's other ones like Mars rebelling and the rebellion on the moon, destroying all the stuff that's on the moon and potentially invading Earth. And you can there's some bad guy on Mercury who you can manipulate. So there's all these potential crises that can come up, but only if there's enough crisis tiles and only if the die rolls come up in that favor. And that's really it. I know I skirted over some things, but that's the general gist of the game. You're trying to get as much income as you can on each planet in order to get the most victory points at the end of the third period. That is essentially Onward to Venus. Let's get to my final thoughts.
I really adore the theme of Onward to Venus. And I know that Martin Wallace gets kind of a rap as sort of a dry Euro gamer and war gamer. He's done some war-ish type games. And I know, I get that. I mean, I haven't played any of those games. I've only played a couple of his other games and his later work, which seems to be much more thematic. I know that he had a train fetish for a while. I don't quite get that, but this game is way thematic. It really brought it out. And again, not even having read the original graphic novels this was based on, I really got that. It ties in tightly with the components. You have all these cool planet tiles, and then all the little tiles that can come out representing the different crises and the different alien tokens that might potentially come out when the crisis happens. And then all the different cards that you have to use and the ray guns, and you've got the space tanks, and you're invading with all this really kitschy retro stuff. I don't know, it really came out to me. It really spoke to me, like this whole retro sci-fi thing, which I'm not a huge fan of, but I really liked it here. So I thought the theme was solid, which is something I wasn't really counting on, but I was really pleasantly surprised that it was there. And all the components are of a very good quality, including the wooden dice. And I know that, or I suspect that there was a deluxe edition of this for subscribers of Tree Frog Games, which I'll never get tired of saying. And I don't know what exactly that was. I know there were some wooden bits that weren't in the retail edition of the game. But I don't think this is like I didn't get the Kickstarter exclusive type of thing. I think it's perfectly fine as it is with the retail edition. It looks really, really good. Artwork is fantastic. So going on to the mechanics, people, I think, are going to be very surprised by how light this is. Not that this is like really light. I still might put it closer to mid-weight as far as actually sitting down to play turn to turn. But still, compared to what the games of Martin Wallace that I've played prior to this or concurrent with this, and also what I know about other games that he's produced, this is way light. It's really just very simple area control, trying to get points down on the planets due to income. It's not just warring with each other, although that can happen. It's just trying to get the most of your stuff, factories and mines, down on these planets, while also taking other stuff and getting points for those. Big game and the crisis tiles if you can manage it, and perhaps even alien ships, although that's kind of rare. I'll get back to that in a second. Despite how simple it is, it works pretty well, and it ties in pretty good with the theme. You have the spaceships that have to take your infantry, and you can only move a certain number of spaces and then making attempts to claim a tile. Some things are kind of unthematic, and you have to kind of make up your own stories for, like, I go here and draw some cards. What does that represent? Well, it kind of represents you gathering your forces and mustering troops and recruiting people from the deck of cards, which could represent personalities and items and tech and things like that. So it makes a little bit of thematic sense. And hunting big alien game and going after aliens is way more thematic than most of the other stuff. And nothing ever happens on Ganymede. I think that's funny. One of the most interesting things about the game is the idea of the crisis, not the crisis tiles, but the escalate. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the name for some reason now. It's been a long night, but the tension tiles. That's what it is. I don't know why I couldn't think of that, but the tension tiles are the tiles that let other players bash each other. You can, once the tension tile is out, you can go after the tension tile, and if you succeed, you're allowed to replace one of the mines or factories that are on the planet with one of yours. And even though you're nominally going after the tile, what it really is going after the other player, and their forces add to the combined forces that they have in orbit and on the planet add to the defense of the thing that you're trying to take. And then it's a showdown, and you have to try and roll and make that work for you. And I think that that's very, very interesting, because it means that people could easily get frustrated in an area control game of the constant take that of like making a huge army, coming over and taking your stuff, and there's nothing you can do about it. Well, here there's something you can do about it, because it might just not happen. It's kind of the great equalizer. You're drawing randomly from the bag, and you never know whether or not one of those tension tokens is going to come out and where it's going to come out. And you might leave all of your stuff behind like, oh man, I hope that my stuff doesn't get taken while I take my army over here. And it doesn't, because the tension tile doesn't come out. But there's the rub. That's one of the issues that I have with the game, is that while that is great and that can really keep the sort of stress of the game down, it also means that if someone is running away with the game, which has pretty much happened in every game of this I've played, where the winner has won by a pretty wide margin, if someone is running away with it, you really can't do too much to stop them once they have a majority on a planet, unless those tension tiles come out. But you only have 3 periods of the game in which to have those tension tiles come out. So I'm not saying that the solution is to have the game be longer, but perhaps more of a chance of you actually being able to interact with the other players and take away their stuff might be better. And that's not to say that there's not cards that won't let you do things like that, but it's tough to get those cards. That's another issue with the game, is that the hand management aspect is neat, but sometimes you do everything you can do to get as many cards as you can, and you just don't get the stuff that you need. It just happens. I know my very first game of this, that happened to me in spades, where got to the last period of the game and I'm like, there is not a play I can make right now using the normal actions of the game that is going to get me ahead. I need to get powerful cards. And I did everything I could to draw as many cards as possible, cycling them out, using special abilities of other cards to cycle out other cards and put more in, getting every one of those draw 2 tokens that I could, and I ended up with nothing but junk, while the other players in the game had tons of powerful cards. That might just sound like grousing and complaining, but I saw this happen again and again, where it's random. You just don't get the right stuff that you need. And I think that that's going to be the problem for a lot of people playing this game, is that it is way more random than you would suspect. Randomness in the card drawing, randomness in the 3 dice, randomness in drawing tiles out of the bag and not getting anything that's really going to help you. It's possible for you to get a lot of tokens that are just like the money tokens or the big game tokens, which are okay, or just crisis tiles, where another player, it's the start of the round, they're up first, and they've got a bunch of the neutral mines and factories on their planet. They're like, ooh, don't mind if I do. And no tension tiles come out there, so no one's going to stop them from getting them, and then they won't be able to take them away either. And you only have a limited range of movement. If this happens all the way on the other side of the galaxy, or the solar system, there's not much you can do over where you are. How many movements are you willing to sacrifice? How many turns? How many special movement cards are you willing to sacrifice in order to get all the way over there? And by the time you get there, there's not much you can do. I think that can be very frustrating. I know it was frustrating for me and some of the other people that I played with, and I think that it will be for some people who are expecting a much more deeper, thinkier, strategic game. This is why I say that it's light. Also, the dice rolling can be a bit of a frustrating situation. First off, I understand that you need to keep track of casualties to some degree, and maybe that's why there's the whole 3 dice system, but it's just weird. And everyone I've explained it to who didn't actually play the game with us felt the same way. Like, oh, in this game you roll 3 dice, dump the middle, subtract the lesser from the bigger, and then see how many skull and crossbones you have. That is just weird and clunky. And I don't know if it was put in there just for flavor, like this is how the dice system is for this game. Or if it was just they couldn't think, or the designer couldn't think of a better way to keep track of the casualties and wanted to mix it all up into one roll. But it ends up being kind of clunky and very, very swingy. People, when they needed it, were able to roll straight numbers. If you roll 3 of the same number, it's 0 defense. Whereas you might come with a huge force and be like, okay, all I have to do is not roll terribly, and then that person, of course, rolls the worst possible roll, which would be a skull and crossbones and a 6. And there's nothing you can really do about it at that point. You have some mitigation with the cards, but again, if you don't have the right cards, you're stuck. So it sounds like I'm really, really bashing the game. And I'm kind of not, I kind of am. There's a lot of stuff that I really like about it. I love the idea of the tension tiles and of the tiles coming out in general. And I love the moving out and taking territory. Even the end game victory condition is neat to me because it's all about points, like any kind of game that you see nowadays. But you get the points by making the most income, not the pile of money that you have in front of you, but the income that is being generated at that planet. That to me was very, very fascinating. And the fact that there's friendly ties and that swing back and forth of trying to go for first, second, and third place, I really enjoyed that. Last thing I want to talk about, and it's a thing that could have potentially been the greatest thing about this game, but ended up being pretty disappointing, is the idea of the crises. Now, there's a whole sheet that comes with the game, and I showed it in the overview, that has all these different crises that could happen. And you have a whole section of the game, a whole phase of each of the rounds, the periods, where you have to check for crisis. You roll dice and potentially put them onto the crisis tiles if they come up as skull and crossbones, and then check the level of the sheet. It's this whole complicated process. And most of the time, nothing will happen. It is so random whether or not it will, and it's only happened to us a couple of times, and it's never gotten to a level where it was anything really that earth-shattering. And it's so exciting. You want it to happen. You want to see the robot uprising. You want to see more aliens flood onto the board. But it's so rare that it happens, and I feel like that's kind of a wasted opportunity. I could see it being a problem if it was happening too often. It makes the game way too chaotic, even more than it is, and just sort of drowns out some of the other aspects of the game. But still, you have it there. It's a very cool thematic thing. Why not use it? So I just kind of wish that stuff happened more. It really would have brought out the flavor of the game. But still, the things I said I liked about the game, I really like. I think that it's fairly light. It doesn't last too long. I think that depending on the number of players, 60 to 90 minutes is not unreasonable. If you're playing with a group of people that you really know, who really know the game well, you're going to be flying through those turns really quick. And, the whole variable turn order thing with the pass cubes is neat as well, which means that it's possible that if someone just wants it to end, the game is not going to drag on too long for that person because, again, it can be possible to just have a slam dunk winner in the game and know that you're pretty much out of it at a certain point, which is a bummer, but I do think that it's a good game. It's just not a great game. It kind of just missed that mark of greatness, but I like it. I'm holding on to it for now because I love the theme so much. I love the idea of it. I love the little bits and pieces of it that are just phenomenal. And I hope that maybe with an expansion or with some little rules tweaks, which unfortunately Martin Wallace is known for, that it will rise to greatness at some point. But as far as it is right now, it's just a good, interesting, but not perfect game. That is Onward to Venus from Martin Wallace.
Thanks for watching. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Patreon. And make sure to check out our sponsor, Board Game Bliss, where you can find an amazing selection of games from around the world. BoardGameBliss.com. Thanks for your support.